Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less nutritious and a lot more indulgent. A trip through the sweet, spicy, intoxicating world of Maya junk food. Yes, they had it. No deep fryers, no vending machines. But make no mistake, the Maya loved their treats. And trust me, things got weird and sometimes surprisingly delicious. We're heading back 1,500 years before McDonald's existed, to a world where chocolate was bitter and mixed with chili peppers, where honey was more precious than gold, and where getting drunk was literally a religious experience. The Maya didn't have processed sugar or artificial flavors, but they had something better. They had creativity, they had ritual, and they had a serious sweet tooth that they satisfied in ways that would make modern foodies jealous. Tonight, we're exploring the treats that made Maya nobles fight wars, the snacks that were literally food for the gods, and the ancient party foods that kept entire civilizations dancing until dawn. We'll discover why some junk food was so sacred it could only be consumed by priests, why chewing gum was invented in a jungle temple, and how the Maya managed to create addictive comfort foods using nothing but plants, honey, and pure ingenuity. So grab your favorite snack, preferably something chocolate, and let's find out what happened when one of history's most sophisticated civilizations decided to get creative with their food. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's tempting to imagine the ancient Maya as a civilization of perfectly disciplined corn eaters, grinding maize while contemplating the cosmos like ancient lifestyle influencers with really good posture. But under all that jade and elaborate headdresses, there were people, regular, flawed people, who occasionally looked at a handful of cacao beans and thought, well, let's see what happens if I mix this with chili peppers and drink it until I can hear the gods laughing. And who could blame them? There was no Netflix, no Starbucks, no convenience stores. And the local entertainment was either watching priests calculate calendar cycles or wondering how long your neighbor could keep dancing before collapsing from ritual exhaustion. So if someone told you there was a honey-sweetened tamale that made you forget about your back-breaking agricultural duties for a few hours, you'd probably eat it too. It was like stress eating, but with more religious significance and fewer delivery apps. The concept of using food for pleasure wasn't rare in Maya culture. It was baked right in, like chocolate chips in cookies. Except the cookies were made of corn, and the chocolate chips could get you in trouble with the gods. But it wasn't called junk food. There were no ancient Maya teenagers sneaking candy behind the pyramid steps or hiding energy drinks in their school lockers. It was wrapped in terms like sacred nourishment, ritual sustenance, or divine offerings. Maya junk food meant anything that served pleasure over necessity, status over survival, or ritual over regular nutrition. It was food that made you feel special, marked important occasions, or was rare enough to be valuable. Think of it as the difference between eating corn, because you had to, and drinking honey-sweetened cacao, because you wanted to taste what the gods tasted. It was like the difference between eating instant ramen and going to a Michelin-starred restaurant, except the restaurant was a temple, and the chef was a priest who might sacrifice you if you didn't appreciate the flavor profile. The Maya had cacao that made your tongue tingle, honey that was literally worth more than gold, tamales so sweet they were considered gifts worthy of the gods, and alcoholic drinks that made people believe they were communicating with their ancestors. Getting your hands on these treats wasn't necessarily recreational. It was ceremonial, medicinal, or sometimes just very good timing during a religious festival. It was like having VIP access to the world's most exclusive club, except the club was run by supernatural beings, and the membership fee was occasionally human sacrifice. and depending on your social rank, it might have been delivered by a priest, a noble's cook, or a barefoot commoner who learned the recipe from a very wise jaguar shaman. In the Maya world, you didn't need a modern grocery store to get your hands on mind-altering deliciousness. All you needed was access to the right social circles, a handful of cacao beans for currency, and a vague disregard for the fact that some of these treats were supposed to be reserved for gods. The Maya world was overflowing with plants, fruits, tree saps, and animal products that could either satisfy your sweet tooth or make you believe you'd been chosen by the corn god to lead the next harvest ceremony. The line between everyday sustenance and sacred indulgence was, let's say, creatively interpreted. Just like modern junk food, Maya treats were often bad for you in large quantities, expensive compared to regular food, and absolutely irresistible once you got a taste. The Maya didn't have processed sugar or artificial flavors, but they had something better: creativity, ritual, and a deep understanding of how to turn simple ingredients into foods worth fighting wars over. They turned chocolate into a sacred beverage, made honey into liquid gold, and created tamales so perfect they were considered appropriate offerings for the gods. And they did it all without a single preservative, artificial flavor, or marketing campaign. Just pure, creative, indulgent genius that happened to taste incredible and occasionally required blood sacrifice to obtain. It was like having a civilization built around the concept that food should be both delicious and spiritually meaningful, which is basically what we're all trying to achieve when we post pictures of our brunch on Instagram, except with more actual meaning and better flavor profiles. Before we dive into the good stuff, the chocolate, the honey, the party foods that made Maya nobles fight wars, let's talk about what the Maya actually ate on a regular Tuesday when the gods weren't demanding elaborate feasts and nobody was getting married or sacrificed. The Maya diet was basically the ancient equivalent of a modern health food blog, if health food blogs required you to perform religious ceremonies before every meal. Corn, beans, and squash formed what they called the Three Sisters, a nutritional trio that provided complete proteins and kept entire civilizations running. It was like meal prep, but with more astronomical calculations and fewer Instagram posts. Most Maya families grew their food in small backyard plots called milpas, which were basically ancient victory gardens that happened to be incredibly sophisticated agricultural systems. They practiced crop rotation, companion planting, and sustainable farming techniques that are still used today. It was like permaculture, but with more religious ceremonies and fewer YouTube tutorials. The average Maya meal was corn tortillas, beans, maybe some squash, and whatever vegetables they could grow or forage. It was nutritious, filling, and about as exciting as watching paint dry in a humidity chamber. Think of it as eating the same healthy grain bowl every day for your entire life, except the grain bowl was blessed by priests and you couldn't get it delivered. Meat was rare and expensive, like ordering premium sushi, but the sushi was iguana and you had to catch it yourself. Most people ate it maybe once a week, if they were lucky. Fish was available if you lived near water, but preserving it without refrigeration was challenging. The Maya were essentially operating on a plant-based diet by necessity, not choice, and they made it work remarkably well. It was like being vegan, but without the moral superiority or oat milk options. Water was the standard drink. Not flavored water, not sparkling water, just water from cenotes and rainwater collection systems. It was clean, safe, and about as thrilling as you'd expect water to be. Think of it as the ultimate minimalist beverage. No additives, no artificial flavors, and definitely no marketing budget. And here's the important part. Chocolate wasn't an everyday drink. That bitter, foamy, chili-spiked cacao beverage that we think of as quintessentially Maya. Most people never tasted it. It was reserved for nobility, priests, and special ceremonies. It was like having Dom Perignon at every meal. Theoretically possible if you were incredibly wealthy, but not something regular people experienced. Except instead of champagne, it was bitter liquid that required extensive ritual preparation and tasted like spicy dirt. The Maya understood nutrition in ways that would impress modern dietitians, assuming modern dietitians were also comfortable with human sacrifice and astronomical worship. They knew that corn and beans together provided complete proteins. They knew that chili peppers were rich in vitamins. They knew that avocados provided healthy fats and that tomatoes added essential nutrients to their diet. But they also understood that food was about more than just nutrition. It was about social status, religious significance, and cultural identity. The difference between everyday food and special occasion food wasn't just about taste. It was about meaning, ceremony, and the kind of experiences that made life worth living. It was like the difference between eating a protein bar and having a 5-course tasting menu, but with more gods involved and higher stakes. This is why Maya junk food was so significant. When your daily diet consisted of corn, beans, and vegetables, a honey-sweetened tamale wasn't just a treat, it was a transformation. When your usual drink was plain water, a cup of frothy chocolate wasn't just a beverage. It was a religious experience that happened to taste like spicy mud. The Maya created a sustainable, nutritious, plant-based diet that supported millions of people for over 1,000 years. They did it without modern agriculture, without dietary supplements, and without the kind of nutritional knowledge that we take for granted today. It was like running a successful civilization on nothing but farmers' market ingredients and really good planning. But they also created a culture where special foods were truly special, where treats were rare enough to be meaningful, and where the difference between everyday sustenance and festive indulgence was dramatic enough to matter. It was like living in a world where every dessert was a special occasion, because dessert barely existed. This is the backdrop against which Maya junk food becomes really interesting. When your normal diet is corn and beans, chocolate mixed with chili peppers isn't just unusual, it's revolutionary. When your usual sweetener is nothing, honey becomes liquid gold. When your typical protein is beans, roasted iguana becomes a luxury worth fighting over. The Maya didn't need processed foods or artificial flavors to create treats that were exciting, because the contrast between their everyday diet and their special occasion foods was already dramatic enough to make even simple indulgences feel extraordinary. It was like having a palate so clean that water tasted like wine, except the wine was actually bitter chocolate, and you had to pray to 3 different gods before drinking it. Let's talk about chocolate. But before you start thinking about Hershey's bars or your favorite latte, let me stop you right there. Maya chocolate was nothing like what you'd recognize today. It was bitter, spicy, foamy, and occasionally mixed with human blood for special occasions. It was like if someone took your favorite Starbucks drink and replaced the sugar with chili peppers, the milk with corn gruel, and the whipped cream with religious significance. The Maya didn't discover chocolate, they invented it. Cacao beans were literally growing in their backyard, and they looked at these bitter, astringent seeds and thought, you know what? Let's turn this into a drink that tastes like liquid earth mixed with fire, and then we'll convince everyone it's the food of the gods. And somehow, it worked. The preparation process was an art form that would make modern baristas weep. First, the cacao beans were roasted over an open fire until they reached the perfect level of bitterness. Then they were ground by hand using stone tools, creating a paste that was mixed with water, cornmeal, and a variety of spices that would make your tongue question its life choices. But here's where it gets interesting. The Maya didn't just stir their chocolate, they poured it from a height, repeatedly, between 2 vessels, creating a frothy foam that was considered essential for proper chocolate consumption. The pouring technique wasn't just for show, It was believed to awaken the spirit of the cacao and make it more pleasing to the gods. Maya chocolate preparation was like a religious ceremony crossed with a coffee shop routine, performed by people who understood that presentation could literally determine cosmic favor. The chocolate was served in ornate ceramic vessels that were works of art in themselves. These cups were decorated with intricate glyphs that told stories about the cacao's journey from bean to beverage, the religious significance of the ceremony, and sometimes the specific occasion for which the chocolate was being consumed. The flavor profile was challenging. Maya chocolate was bitter, with notes of earth, smoke, and whatever spices had been added to make it theoretically more palatable. Common additions included chili peppers, vanilla, honey, if you were lucky, and various flowers that added complexity to the already intense flavor. For special ceremonies, Maya chocolate got even more intense. Sometimes it was mixed with actual human blood, usually from ritual bloodletting ceremonies, to create a drink that was considered especially sacred and powerful. It was like adding a protein powder to your smoothie, except the protein came from your own arm, and the smoothie was already psychologically challenging to consume. The Maya believed that cacao was a gift from the gods, specifically the feathered serpent god Kukulkan, who had brought the sacred beans to humanity as a way of connecting the earthly and divine realms. Drinking chocolate wasn't just refreshing, it was a form of communion with supernatural forces. It was like taking communion, but with more caffeine and a significantly more complex flavor profile. Cacao beans were also used as currency, which meant that chocolate was literally money you could drink. A single tomato might cost 1 cacao bean, while a turkey could cost 200 beans. This created interesting economic decisions. You could either drink your wealth or spend it on food that didn't require religious preparation. The social significance of chocolate consumption was enormous. Only nobles, priests, and warriors were allowed to drink chocolate regularly, and the quality of your chocolate service indicated your social status. Common people might taste chocolate once or twice in their entire lives, during major religious festivals or life-changing ceremonies. Maya chocolate preparation required specific tools, techniques, and knowledge that took years to master. The chocolate preparers were specialists who understood not just the physical process of making the drink, but the spiritual significance of each step. They knew which prayers to say, which direction to pour, and how to create the perfect foam that would please both human drinkers and divine observers. The Maya also created different types of chocolate for different occasions. There was everyday chocolate for nobles, ceremonial chocolate for religious festivals, warrior chocolate for before battles, and funeral chocolate for sending the deceased into the afterlife with appropriate refreshment. The chocolate drinking experience was communal and ritualized. People didn't just grab a cup and drink it while scrolling through their phones. They gathered in groups, followed specific protocols, and treated the consumption as a meaningful social and spiritual event. The Maya understood that chocolate was more than just a beverage. It was a technology for connecting with the divine, a tool for social organization, and a way of transforming ordinary social gatherings into meaningful spiritual experiences. They took a bitter seed and turned it into one of the most important cultural and religious elements of their civilization. And they did it all without sugar, without milk, and without any of the modern processing techniques that make chocolate palatable to contemporary tastes. They created a chocolate culture based purely on the natural properties of cacao beans and their ability to convince people that bitter, spicy, foamy drinks were actually divine gifts worthy of religious devotion. It was like creating an entire civilization around the concept that coffee should taste terrible, but be spiritually meaningful, and somehow making it work for over 1,000 years. The Maya didn't have sugar cane, they didn't have sugar beets, and they definitely didn't have high fructose corn syrup. What they had was honey, and they treated it with the kind of reverence that modern people reserve for winning lottery tickets or finding the last croissant at a fancy bakery. Honey wasn't just sweetener in Maya society, it was liquid gold, divine nectar, and the closest thing to magic that you could actually eat. The Maya were so obsessed with honey that they built entire religious systems around it, worshipped bee gods, and developed beekeeping techniques that are still used today in the Yucatan Peninsula. They were basically the ancient equivalent of those people who won't shut up about their local farmers' market honey, except their obsession was backed by actual gods. The honey came from Melipona bees, which are stingless bees that produce honey with a completely different flavor profile than what you'd find squirted into your tea at a chain restaurant. Melipona honey is more complex, more floral, and has a slight tanginess that made it perfect for both culinary and medicinal uses. These bees were smaller than European honeybees, produced less honey per hive, and were infinitely more valuable to Maya society. Think of them as the artisanal craft beer of the bee world, except the craft beer was actually bee vomit, and people would kill for it. Maya beekeeping involved hollow logs that were carefully prepared to house bee colonies, basically ancient condos for bees, but with better property management. The logs were positioned horizontally, sealed at both ends except for small entrance holes, and arranged in structures that looked remarkably similar to modern beehives. The Maya understood bee behavior, seasonal patterns, and hive management in ways that would impress contemporary beekeepers who have access to YouTube tutorials and specialized equipment. The bee gods featured prominently in Maya iconography and religious ceremonies. Ar-Muzen-Kab was the principal bee deity, depicted as a human figure with bee characteristics who presided over honey production and hive management. The Maya believed that proper worship of the bee gods was essential for successful honey harvests, which meant that beekeeping was as much a religious practice as an agricultural one. Imagine having to pray to a specific god every time you wanted to check on your backyard chickens, except the chickens could fly and their eggs were worth more than your house. Honey collection was a ceremonial process that required specific prayers, proper timing, and careful attention to the spiritual significance of disturbing the bees' work. The Maya understood that bees were divine creatures producing a sacred substance, and they approached honey collection with the same reverence they brought to other religious obligations. Modern beekeepers just wear protective suits and hope for the best, but the Maya had to worry about both bee stings and divine retribution. The honey was used in ways that would make modern sugar addicts weep with envy. Maya cooks mixed honey into tamales, creating sweet versions that were served during festivals and religious ceremonies. They made honey-based drinks that were consumed during celebrations, mixed honey with cacao to create sweetened chocolate, and used honey in medicinal preparations that were supposed to cure everything from coughs to spiritual ailments. Honey was their Swiss Army knife of sweeteners, except the Swiss Army knife was made of bee spit and cost more than most people's annual income. Honey tamales were particularly significant because they represented the combination of corn, the sacred grain, with honey, the divine sweetener. These tamales were wrapped in banana leaves and cooked in underground ovens called pib, which gave them a distinctive smoky flavor that complemented the honey's natural sweetness. The result was a dessert that was considered appropriate for offering to the gods, assuming the gods had a sweet tooth and appreciated good presentation. The Maya also created honey-based fermented beverages that were consumed during religious ceremonies and social gatherings. These drinks were mildly alcoholic, naturally carbonated, and flavored with various herbs and spices. They were the ancient equivalent of craft cocktails, except the craft involved religious preparation. The cocktails were blessed by priests, and the bartender might sacrifice you if you complained about the flavor. Maya medicine relied heavily on honey as both a healing agent and a delivery system for other medicinal substances. Honey was mixed with herbs, ground jade, and various plant extracts to create remedies that were applied topically or consumed as treatments for different ailments. The Maya understood that honey had natural antibacterial properties, even if they couldn't explain the scientific mechanism behind its effectiveness. They were basically practicing evidence-based medicine, except the evidence was this worked last time, and the practice involved significantly more prayer. The economic value of honey was enormous. A single jar of high-quality honey could be worth more than a month's worth of corn, making beekeeping one of the most lucrative occupations in Maya society. Successful beekeepers were often wealthy enough to afford luxury goods, elaborate clothing, and the kind of social status that came with controlling a valuable and scarce resource. They were the ancient equivalent of tech entrepreneurs, except their startup was insects and their IPO was measured in jars of bee vomit. Honey theft was a serious crime that could result in severe punishment, including physical beatings, economic penalties, and social ostracism. The Maya developed complex legal systems for protecting beekeepers' rights and ensuring that honey production remained profitable for the people who invested the time and effort required for successful hive management. Stealing honey was basically grand theft auto, except the auto was a log full of bees and the theft could get you beaten by priests. The Maya also used honey as a preservation method for other foods. Fruits, nuts, and even some meats could be preserved in honey, creating long-lasting food stores that were both nutritious and delicious. This preservation technique was particularly important during the dry season, when fresh food was scarce and stored provisions meant the difference between survival and starvation. Honey was their refrigerator, their pantry, and their emergency food supply, all rolled into one sticky, divine package. Maya honey production was sustainable and environmentally conscious, in ways that would impress modern eco-warriors who drive hybrid cars and bring reusable bags to the grocery store. The Maya understood that healthy bee populations required diverse flowering plants, so they maintained gardens and forest areas specifically designed to support bee colonies. They practiced what would now be called regenerative agriculture, creating ecosystems that benefited both human food production and bee welfare. The Maya created an entire honey-based economy that supported specialized crafts, religious practices, and social structures. They turned bee management into an art form, honey consumption into a religious experience, and sweetness into a luxury that was worth more than gold. And they did it all with stingless bees, hollow logs, and a deep understanding of the relationship between human needs and natural systems. They created a sustainable sweetener economy that lasted for centuries and produced honey that was considered worthy of the gods themselves. Meanwhile, modern people put high fructose corn syrup in everything and call it progress. If honey was the Maya's liquid gold, then sweet tamales were their edible treasure chests, little bundles of joy wrapped in banana leaves that made special occasions actually special, rather than just Tuesday, but with more dancing and potential human sacrifice. Sweet tamales weren't your everyday food. These were the Maya equivalent of birthday cake, Christmas cookies, and Valentine's Day chocolate, all rolled into one perfectly portable package. They were festival food, celebration food, and thank the gods we survived another harvest season food. Regular tamales were filled with beans or meat and served the practical purpose of keeping people alive. Sweet tamales were filled with honey, ground pumpkin seeds, and sweetened mesa, and served the much more important purpose of making life worth living. The preparation process was elaborate enough to require multiple people, several days, and the kind of organizational skills that would impress modern event planners who get stressed about coordinating a birthday party. Maya women would gather in groups to prepare hundreds of tamales for major festivals, turning the process into a social event that was part cooking class, part gossip session, and part religious ceremony. The masa for sweet tamales was different from regular tamale masa. It was ground finer, mixed with honey or fruit juices, and often colored with natural dyes to create tamales that were as beautiful as they were delicious. Red tamales were colored with achiote, yellow tamales with saffron-like spices, and some special occasion tamales were even tinted with cochineal insects to create a vibrant red that said, "This cost more than your house." The fillings were where sweet tamales got really creative. Honey-sweetened masa was the base, but Maya cooks added ground pumpkin seeds, vanilla, cacao, dried fruits, and various nuts to create flavor combinations that would make modern pastry chefs take notes. Some tamales were filled with sweetened black beans that had been cooked until they were more like dessert than legume. Others contained fruit pastes made from native Maya fruits that don't even exist in modern grocery stores. The wrapping process was an art form that required skill, patience, and banana leaves that had been carefully selected, cleaned, and prepared for their important role as edible packaging. Maya cooks could wrap tamales faster than most people can unwrap Christmas presents, creating perfect little bundles that steamed evenly and opened like gifts when you unwrapped them. The banana leaf wrapper wasn't just functional. It imparted a subtle earthy flavor to the tamales and made them look like presents from the gods. Cooking sweet tamales required underground ovens called pib, which were basically earth-powered slow cookers that operated on the principle of dig a hole, fill it with hot rocks, add food, cover with dirt, and pray the timing works out. The PIB cooking process took hours and required careful attention to temperature, moisture, and the spiritual significance of cooking festival food in sacred earth. Modern slow cookers are convenient, but they lack the religious gravitas of food that's literally cooked in the ground. Sweet tamales were served during specific festivals and ceremonies, each with their own traditions about which types of tamales were appropriate and who was allowed to eat them first. During corn harvest festivals, tamales filled with fresh corn and honey celebrated the successful growing season. During winter solstice ceremonies, tamales made with preserved fruits and nuts provided comfort during the darkest time of year. During royal celebrations, tamales filled with cacao and vanilla demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of Maya cuisine. The social hierarchy of tamale consumption was as complex as modern restaurant reservations, but with higher stakes. The best tamales, those with the most honey, the finest ingredients, and the most elaborate preparation, were reserved for nobles, priests, and honored guests. Common people got simpler versions that were still delicious, but didn't contain ingredients that cost more than most people's annual income. Children got small tamales that were sized appropriately for their social status and digestive capacity. Some sweet tamales were so special they were considered appropriate offerings for the gods. These tamales were prepared with extra care, wrapped in the finest banana leaves, and presented on ceremonial plates before being offered to divine beings who presumably appreciated good packaging as much as good flavor. The gods apparently had refined tastes and expected their food to be presented with the same attention to detail that modern Instagram influencers bring to their latte photography. The Maya also created portable sweet tamales that could be carried on long journeys, traded in markets, or stored for later consumption. These travel tamales were wrapped in multiple layers of banana leaves and sealed with natural waxes to create ancient versions of energy bars. They were nutritious, long-lasting, and provided the kind of sustained energy that was necessary for activities like long-distance trading, military campaigns, or fleeing from jaguars. Festival tamale preparation was a community event that brought together extended families, neighbors, and friends in massive cooking operations that required coordination, cooperation, and the ability to work around open fires without setting anyone's elaborate headdress ablaze. These cooking sessions were social events where news was shared, marriages were arranged, and the next generation learned the complex skills required for proper tamale preparation. Maya sweet tamales were also used as diplomatic gifts, trade goods, and tokens of appreciation that could smooth social relationships and demonstrate cultural sophistication. Bringing high-quality sweet tamales to a social gathering was the ancient equivalent of bringing really good wine to a dinner party, except the wine was wrapped in leaves, and the dinner party might involve ritual bloodletting. The seasonal nature of sweet tamale ingredients meant that different festivals featured different flavors depending on what was available when the celebration occurred. Spring festivals might feature tamales made with fresh fruits and early honey harvests. Fall festivals would showcase tamales made with nuts, preserved fruits, and the finest honey from the year's best harvests. Winter celebrations featured tamales made with stored ingredients that had been carefully preserved for special occasions. Sweet tamales were also used in coming-of-age ceremonies, wedding celebrations, and funeral rituals, marking important life transitions with food that was both delicious and meaningful. Maya families had traditional tamale recipes that were passed down through generations, creating culinary traditions that connected people to their ancestors and their cultural heritage. The Maya created a tamale culture that transformed simple ingredients into elaborate festival foods that were appropriate for gods, nobles, and special occasions. They turned corn, honey, and creativity into edible celebrations that made important events memorable and provided sweetness in a world where sweetness was rare and valuable. And they did it all without modern kitchen equipment, standardized measurements, or the ability to order banana leaves from Amazon. They created festival foods that were worthy of their sophisticated civilization and delicious enough to make the gods jealous of human culinary skills. Sweet tamales were proof that the Maya understood something important about food. The best dishes aren't just about nutrition or survival. They're about joy, celebration, and the kind of sweetness that makes life worth living, even when that life involves regular human sacrifice and the constant threat of jaguar attacks. In Maya society, eating meat was the ancient equivalent of dining at a Michelin-starred restaurant. It was expensive, rare, and usually involved consuming animals that would make modern diners question their life choices. While most people survived perfectly well on corn, beans, and vegetables, meat was the ultimate luxury item that separated the nobles from the commoners and the brave from the squeamish. The Maya domesticated exactly 2 animals for food: turkeys and dogs. That's it. No cows, no pigs, no chickens strutting around their backyards. This meant that when Maya people wanted a protein-rich feast, they had to get creative with whatever was wandering, flying, or crawling through the jungle. And the Maya got very creative indeed. Iguana was considered premium dining, which tells you everything you need to know about Maya culinary standards. These large lizards were hunted in the wild, captured alive, and kept in pens until they were ready for cooking. Iguanas could grow to be 4 feet long and were prized for their supposedly delicious meat that tasted like chicken, assuming chicken had spent its entire life sunbathing on rocks and eating jungle vegetation. Modern food critics might describe iguana as sustainably sourced reptilian protein with earthy undertones, but the Maya just called it dinner for important people. Wild turkeys were another luxury protein that required significant hunting skills to obtain. These weren't the docile, overfed birds that grace modern Thanksgiving tables. They were smart, fast, and perfectly capable of evading hunters who were armed with nothing more sophisticated than spears and determination. Successfully hunting a wild turkey was an achievement that demonstrated skill, patience, and the kind of wilderness knowledge that most modern people have completely lost. Maya turkey hunters were the ancient equivalent of master chefs who could catch their own ingredients. Peccaries, which are basically wild pigs with attitude problems, were considered excellent eating, assuming you could catch them without getting trampled, gored, or otherwise injured by animals that had evolved to survive in jaguar-infested jungles. Peccary hunting was dangerous enough to be considered a demonstration of courage and skill. making peccary meat a status symbol that said, "I'm brave enough to fight wild pigs for my dinner." But the Maya didn't stop at conventional jungle animals. They also ate deer, rabbits, various birds, fish, turtles, and, for the truly adventurous, monkeys. Monkey meat was apparently considered a delicacy, which raises interesting questions about Maya dietary ethics and their relationship with animals that shared significant DNA with human consumers. Eating monkey was probably the ancient equivalent of ordering the most expensive item on the menu, just to prove you could afford it. The preparation methods for luxury meats were as elaborate as the hunting process. Maya cooks developed sophisticated techniques for roasting, smoking, and stewing that maximized flavor while minimizing the risk of food poisoning, an important consideration when your medical system was based on herbs, prayers, and hoping the gods were in a healing mood. Meats were often stuffed with mesa, seasoned with chili peppers, and cooked in underground ovens that imparted smoky flavors that modern barbecue enthusiasts would appreciate. The Maya understood that expensive protein deserved careful preparation, and they developed cooking methods that would make contemporary pitmasters jealous of their technique and dedication. The social significance of meat consumption was enormous. Serving meat at a gathering demonstrated wealth, generosity, and the kind of social status that came with being able to afford ingredients that most people never tasted. Maya nobles competed to provide the most elaborate meat dishes at their feasts, creating an ancient version of competitive entertaining, where the stakes were political influence and the menu featured animals that would terrify modern diners. Maya warriors were often rewarded with meat rations that provided the protein necessary for maintaining their fighting strength. Successful warriors earned the right to eat well, which meant consuming foods that were both nutritionally valuable and socially significant. Warrior meat rations were the ancient equivalent of performance bonuses, except the bonus was edible and came from animals that had been personally defeated in combat. Religious ceremonies often featured meat offerings that were first presented to the gods and then consumed by the participants. These ceremonial meals combined spiritual significance with protein consumption, creating religious experiences that were both meaningful and nutritionally satisfying. The gods apparently appreciated good meat as much as human diners, which suggests that divine beings had sophisticated palates and understood the value of rare ingredients. The Maya also developed preservation techniques that allowed them to store meat for later consumption. Smoking, drying, and salt curing were used to create portable protein sources that could sustain travelers, traders, and military expeditions. These preserved meats were the ancient equivalent of protein bars, except the protein bars were made from actual animals and lasted much longer than modern processed foods. Hunting seasons and animal availability created natural cycles of meat consumption that were integrated into Maya, religious, and social calendars. Certain times of year featured specific animals that were at their peak flavor and availability, creating seasonal feasts that celebrated both successful hunting and the natural abundance of the jungle environment. The Maya understood that meat consumption had to be balanced with conservation to ensure that animal populations remained sustainable. They developed hunting practices that maintained ecological balance while still providing the protein necessary for special occasions and elite dining. This was ancient, sustainable agriculture, practiced by people who understood that overhunting would eliminate their luxury food sources. Maya meat preparation was also influenced by practical considerations like food safety, storage limitations, and cooking technology. Without refrigeration, meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved immediately after slaughter. This created social obligations to share fresh meat with extended family and community members, turning meat consumption into community events that strengthened social bonds. The economics of meat consumption were straightforward. It was expensive, labor-intensive, and available only to people who could afford to invest significant time and resources in hunting, trapping, or purchasing animals from specialized hunters. This made meat a reliable indicator of social status and economic success. Maya hunters developed specialized knowledge about animal behavior, habitat preferences, and seasonal patterns that allowed them to locate and capture jungle animals with remarkable efficiency. This knowledge was passed down through generations of hunters who understood that protein procurement required expertise, patience, and the kind of wilderness skills that most modern people would find impossible to master. The Maya created a meat-eating culture that transformed jungle animals into luxury foods worthy of nobles, warriors, and gods. They turned hunting into an art form, meat preparation into a sophisticated culinary practice, and protein consumption into a social and religious experience that was both nutritionally valuable and culturally significant. And they did it all without factory farming, industrial slaughterhouses, or the ability to order exotic meats online. They created luxury dining experiences based purely on their ability to catch, kill, and cook animals that were smart enough, fast enough, and dangerous enough to make meat consumption a genuine achievement rather than a simple transaction. The Maya understood something that modern corporate team-building events are still trying to figure out. Sometimes you need alcohol to properly communicate with supernatural beings, bond with your community, and forget about the fact that your daily life involves backbreaking agricultural labor and the constant threat of being sacrificed to ensure good weather. Maya drinking wasn't casual. There were no Maya college students doing shots at jungle parties or workers stopping by taverns after long days in the fields. Maya alcohol consumption was ritualized, spiritually significant, and conducted with the kind of serious intent that modern people reserve for important business meetings or therapy sessions. The primary Maya alcoholic beverage was balshe, which was made from fermented honey and tree bark. Specifically, the bark of the lonchocarpus tree, which contains natural compounds that enhance the alcohol's psychoactive effects. Balshe wasn't just drunk. It was consumed as a way of altering consciousness, communicating with ancestors, and achieving the kind of spiritual states that required more than just prayer and good intentions. The preparation process for balshe was complex enough to require specialized knowledge and careful attention to timing, ingredients, and spiritual protocols. Maya brewers had to harvest honey at the right time, select bark from trees that had been properly blessed, and ferment the mixture according to traditional methods that had been developed over centuries of trial and error. Modern craft brewers think they're artisanal, but Maya balshe makers were literally brewing religious experiences. Balshe consumption was typically a group activity that took place during religious ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and important social gatherings. The Maya understood that alcohol was a social lubricant that could help people connect with each other and with the divine realm. But they also understood that drinking required proper supervision and spiritual preparation. There were no Maya alcoholics stumbling around the temples. There were Maya spiritual practitioners using alcohol as a tool for achieving altered states of consciousness. The effects of balshe were reportedly more intense than regular fermented beverages, thanks to the psychoactive compounds in the tree bark. Drinkers experienced not just intoxication, but visions, spiritual revelations, and the kind of altered perceptions that were considered evidence of successful communication with the gods. Balshe was the ancient equivalent of ayahuasca, except it was made from honey and bark instead of exotic jungle plants, and the ceremony was probably less likely to involve lengthy discussions about personal growth. Pulque was another Maya alcoholic beverage, made from fermented agave sap that was collected by cutting into agave plants and allowing the sweet liquid to accumulate in natural collecting basins. The sap was then fermented using natural yeasts that created a foamy, slightly sour alcoholic drink that was consumed fresh. Pulque was less psychoactive than balshe, but more accessible. making it the ancient equivalent of beer for people who couldn't afford the premium spiritual experience. The social hierarchy of Maya drinking was as complex as everything else in Maya society. Balshe was typically reserved for nobles, priests, and participants in important religious ceremonies. Pulque was more widely available, but still regulated according to social status and ceremonial appropriateness. Common people might drink diluted versions of these beverages during major festivals, but regular consumption was a privilege reserved for people who could afford the ingredients and the social consequences of regular intoxication. Maya drinking ceremonies often lasted for days and included dancing, chanting, ritual bloodletting, and the kind of intense spiritual experiences that required participants to take time off from their regular responsibilities. These weren't casual happy hours. They were religious retreats that happened to involve alcohol consumption as a method for achieving spiritual enlightenment. The Maya believed that controlled intoxication was necessary for proper communication with ancestors, who could provide guidance, warnings, and supernatural assistance to the living. Alcohol was considered a bridge between the human and spirit worlds, allowing people to temporarily transcend their normal consciousness and access divine wisdom. This was ancient pharmacological spirituality, practiced by people who understood that certain substances could enhance human consciousness when used properly. Maya drinking vessels were works of art that were specifically designed for ceremonial alcohol consumption. These cups, bowls, and pitchers were decorated with images of gods, ancestors, and spiritual symbols that reinforced the religious significance of drinking. The containers themselves were considered sacred objects that enhanced the spiritual power of the beverages they contained. The timing of Maya drinking was carefully regulated according to religious calendars, seasonal cycles, and social obligations. Certain festivals required specific types of alcohol consumption, while other occasions prohibited drinking entirely. The Maya understood that alcohol was a powerful tool that had to be used appropriately to achieve positive spiritual and social outcomes. Maya brewing technology was sophisticated enough to produce consistently alcoholic beverages using natural fermentation processes that modern home brewers would recognize and respect. Maya brewers understood yeast behavior, fermentation timing, and flavor development in ways that allowed them to create complex alcoholic beverages without modern equipment or scientific knowledge. The economic significance of Maya alcohol was substantial. Honey, agave sap, and specialized tree bark were valuable commodities that required significant investment to obtain and process. This made alcoholic beverages luxury items that demonstrated wealth, social status, and access to rare ingredients. Maya nobles competed to provide the finest alcoholic beverages at their celebrations, creating an ancient version of wine collecting that was based on spiritual significance rather than just taste. Maya drinking traditions were passed down through generations of spiritual practitioners who understood not just the technical aspects of alcohol production, but the cultural and religious significance of controlled intoxication. These traditions created social bonds, spiritual experiences, and community celebrations that were both meaningful and memorable. The Maya also understood the dangers of excessive alcohol consumption and developed social controls that prevented drinking from becoming destructive to individuals or communities. Maya alcohol use was regulated by religious authorities, community leaders, and cultural traditions that emphasized moderation, proper timing, and spiritual purpose. Maya drinking ceremonies often included music, storytelling, and artistic performances that created complete cultural experiences around alcohol consumption. These events weren't just about getting drunk. They were about creating shared memories, reinforcing cultural values, and providing opportunities for artistic expression and community bonding. The Maya created an alcohol culture that transformed fermented beverages into tools for spiritual exploration, social cohesion, and cultural expression. They turned honey and tree bark into religious experiences, agave sap into community celebrations, and controlled intoxication into a sophisticated system for accessing divine wisdom and maintaining social relationships. And they did it all without distillation, standardized recipes, or the ability to order specialty brewing equipment online. They created alcoholic beverages that were spiritually meaningful, socially significant, and powerful enough to bridge the gap between human consciousness and divine wisdom. Maya drinking was proof that alcohol doesn't have to be destructive. It can be a tool for building communities, exploring consciousness, and creating the kind of shared experiences that make life richer and more meaningful. Though they probably would have been confused by modern drinking games and definitely wouldn't have understood the concept of designated drivers. Long before movie theaters figured out that they could charge $15 for kernels of corn and some salt, the Maya had already perfected the art of turning simple ingredients into irresistible snacks that people would crave, trade for, and probably fight over if necessary. Maya popcorn wasn't just a casual snack. It was the original finger food, the ancient equivalent of chips and dip, and proof that humans have always understood the fundamental truth that some foods are just more fun when they make noise while you eat them. The Maya were popping corn kernels over open fires using ceramic comals, flat cooking surfaces, that were specifically designed for transforming ordinary corn into puffy, crunchy treats that were infinitely more interesting than regular corn. The popping process was both practical and slightly magical. Maya cooks would heat ceramic comals over fires until they reached the perfect temperature, then add dried corn kernels and cover them with clay lids or ceramic bowls to contain the popping action. The sound of kernels exploding was probably as satisfying to Maya ears as it is to modern moviegoers, except the Maya version came with the added excitement of cooking over open flames without modern safety equipment. Maya popcorn was seasoned with chili powder, salt when available, and various herbs that added complexity to what might otherwise have been just crunchy corn. The Maya understood that snack foods needed flavor enhancement to be truly addictive, so they developed seasoning blends that would make modern snack food manufacturers jealous of their creativity and flavor profiles. The portability of popped corn made it perfect for travel, trade, and situations where people needed convenient food that wouldn't spoil quickly. Maya traders carried popped corn on long journeys. Warriors took it on military campaigns, and families packed it for religious pilgrimages. It was the ancient equivalent of trail mix, except the mix was just corn, and the trail might include jaguar territories and hostile city-states. Maya markets featured vendors who specialized in fresh popped corn that was sold warm from the comals, creating the ancient equivalent of street food that attracted customers with appealing aromas and the promise of immediate satisfaction. These popcorn vendors were probably the first people to understand that food marketing involves all the senses: the sound of popping, the smell of roasted corn, and the visual appeal of fluffy white kernels that looked more interesting than regular corn. Fried dough was another Maya snack innovation that transformed simple masa into treats that were crispy, satisfying, and probably addictive enough to cause social problems if people had unlimited access to the ingredients. Maya cooks made small balls of corn dough that were fried in clay pots filled with rendered animal fat, creating ancient donuts that were sometimes sweetened with honey or flavored with spices. The frying process required skill, patience, and the kind of temperature control that was challenging to achieve using wood fires and ceramic cookware. Maya cooks had to understand oil temperature, cooking timing, and safety procedures that prevented them from accidentally setting their cooking areas on fire or burning themselves with hot fat. Modern deep fryers make the process look easy, but Maya cooks were doing advanced culinary chemistry using Stone Age technology. Maya fried dough came in various shapes and sizes. from small round balls that could be eaten in one bite to larger creations that were meant to be shared among multiple people. Some fried dough was sweet, some was savory, and some was flavored with ingredients that don't exist in modern grocery stores, but probably tasted amazing when combined with properly prepared mesa. The social significance of Maya snack foods was considerable. Sharing popcorn or fried dough was a way of demonstrating hospitality, celebrating successful harvests, and creating social bonds that were reinforced through the communal consumption of foods that were more fun than nutritionally necessary. Maya snack foods were party foods that made gatherings more enjoyable and memorable. Maya festivals featured elaborate snack food preparation that involved entire communities working together to produce large quantities of popped corn, fried dough, and other treats that were distributed to celebration participants. These community cooking sessions were social events that combined food preparation with entertainment, gossip, and the kind of collaborative effort that created lasting social relationships. The seasonal nature of corn availability meant that snack food production was tied to agricultural cycles that determined when communities had surplus corn that could be used for treats rather than basic sustenance. Harvest festivals were particularly abundant times for snack foods, when successful crops provided both the ingredients and the reason for celebration. Maya children probably learned snack food preparation techniques as part of their general education in cooking and food processing. The skills required for proper popcorn popping and dough frying were transferable to other cooking tasks, making snack food preparation a practical form of culinary training that was both educational and enjoyable. The trade value of prepared snack foods was significant enough that specialized snack makers could probably support themselves by producing treats for markets, festivals, and special occasions. Maya entrepreneurs who mastered the art of popcorn, popping, or dough frying could create businesses based on providing convenient, delicious foods that people wanted but couldn't easily make themselves. Maya snack foods were also used as offerings to gods who apparently appreciated the same kinds of treats that humans enjoyed. Popped corn and fried dough were considered appropriate gifts for divine beings, suggesting that the gods had developed tastes for processed foods that were more interesting than raw agricultural products. The preservation qualities of properly prepared snack foods made them valuable for long-term storage and emergency food supplies. Popped corn could last for weeks without spoiling, making it a reliable food source during times when fresh ingredients were scarce or unavailable. Maya cooking technology for snack foods was sophisticated enough to produce consistently good results, using entirely natural materials and manual labor. The ceramic comals used for popcorn were designed specifically for even heat distribution, while the clay pots used for frying were shaped to optimize oil temperature and cooking efficiency. The Maya created a snack food culture that transformed basic corn into treats that were portable, delicious, and socially significant. They turned simple ingredients into party foods that enhanced celebrations, provided convenient nutrition for travelers, and created the kind of shared eating experiences that brought people together. And they did it all without industrial food processing, artificial flavors, or the ability to mass-produce snacks in factories. They created the original finger foods using nothing but corn, creativity, and fire, proving that good snack foods don't require complicated technology, just an understanding of what makes food fun to eat. Maya popcorn and fried dough were proof that humans have always understood the difference between eating for survival and eating for pleasure. Sometimes you need corn to stay alive, and sometimes you need popped corn to make life worth living. The Maya figured this out over 1,000 years ago and built snack foods that were worthy of their sophisticated civilization. Modern movie theaters are still trying to match the profit margins that Maya popcorn vendors probably achieved selling fresh popped corn in ancient marketplaces, except the Maya version came with better seasoning and fewer overpriced beverages. long before teenagers were getting detention for sticking gum under desks, and long before anyone figured out how to blow bubbles with synthetic polymers. The Maya were chewing chicle, tree sap that was basically nature's version of chewing gum, except it came from the jungle, required actual effort to obtain, and probably tasted like you were chewing a tree. Which, technically, you were. Chicle came from the sapodilla tree, a large jungle tree that produced a latex-like sap when its bark was cut in specific patterns by people who understood both tree anatomy and the economic value of chewable tree juice. Maya chicle collectors were basically ancient chewing gum farmers who climbed tall trees with sharp tools and collected sap that would eventually end up in people's mouths. It was dangerous work that required climbing skills, knowledge of tree biology, and the ability to work at heights without modern safety equipment. The chicle extraction process was labor-intensive and seasonal, making fresh chicle a valuable commodity that was worth more than regular tree products. Maya chicle collectors had to know which trees were ready for tapping, how to cut the bark without damaging the tree, and how to collect the sap before it hardened or became contaminated with insects and debris. Modern chewing gum manufacturers just order synthetic ingredients from chemical suppliers, but Maya chicle producers had to literally climb trees for their raw materials. Maya chicle wasn't flavored with artificial mint or fruit extracts. It tasted like tree sap, with natural flavors that varied depending on the specific tree, the season, and how recently the sap had been collected. Fresh chicle had a slightly sweet, resinous flavor that was probably an acquired taste, while older chicle became harder and more bitter as it aged. The Maya chewed it anyway, because they understood that some pleasures don't require artificial enhancement. The social significance of chicle chewing was considerable. Maya nobles chewed chicle as a status symbol that demonstrated their access to luxury items and their ability to engage in activities that were purely for pleasure rather than survival. Chicle chewing was the ancient equivalent of expensive hobbies. It showed that you had enough wealth and leisure time to consume things that weren't strictly necessary for staying alive. Maya priests used chicle in religious ceremonies, chewing it to purify their breath before communicating with gods who apparently preferred their human representatives to have fresh, tree-flavored breath. The act of chewing chicle was considered spiritually cleansing, helping to prepare priests for the kind of divine communication that required proper oral hygiene and respect for sacred protocols. Chicle was also used for practical purposes that would make modern dentists either impressed or horrified, depending on their perspective. The Maya believed that chewing chicle helped clean teeth, strengthen jaw muscles, and remove food particles that could cause dental problems. They were essentially practicing preventive dentistry using tree sap, which was probably more effective than modern sugar-free gum and definitely more natural. Maya chicle chewing was regulated by social customs that determined who could chew, when, where, and in what circumstances. Children and common people were generally discouraged from chicle chewing, which was considered inappropriate for people who should be focusing on more important activities, like survival and agricultural labor. Chicle chewing was a privilege that came with social status and economic success. The Maya also used chicle for non-chewing purposes that demonstrated their understanding of its adhesive and waterproofing properties. Chicle could be used to seal containers, waterproof baskets, and create adhesives for various crafts and construction projects. Modern duct tape has nothing on tree sap when it comes to versatility and all-natural problem-solving. Maya traders carried chicle over long distances, creating trade networks that connected chicle-producing regions with markets where people were willing to pay premium prices for chewable tree products. The chicle trade was sophisticated enough to support specialized collectors, processors, and merchants who understood the economic value of converting trees into luxury consumables. The preparation of chicle for consumption required knowledge and skill that was passed down through generations of chicle specialists. Fresh sap had to be processed to remove impurities, achieve the right consistency, and maintain the flavor and chewing properties that made chicle desirable. Maya chicle processors were essentially artisanal gum makers who understood their product better than modern manufacturers understand synthetic alternatives. Maya chicle chewing etiquette was probably as complex as everything else in Maya society. There were likely proper ways to chew, appropriate places to dispose of used chicle, and social protocols that governed chicle sharing and consumption during formal occasions. Modern gum chewing might seem casual, but Maya chicle chewing was probably governed by rules that made it a refined social activity. The seasonal availability of fresh chicle created cycles of abundance and scarcity that affected both prices and consumption patterns. During chicle season, Maya nobles could enjoy fresh, flavorful tree sap that was at its peak quality. During off-seasons, they had to make do with stored chicle that was harder, less flavorful, and probably less satisfying to chew. Maya children probably learned about chicle from watching adults and understanding that chicle chewing was something to aspire to rather than something they could casually enjoy. The delayed gratification involved in earning the right to chew chicle probably made it more valuable and desirable than modern gum, which is available to anyone with pocket change and access to a convenience store. The Maya created a chicle culture that transformed tree sap into luxury items that demonstrated status, provided oral hygiene benefits, and created the kind of personal pleasure that made life more enjoyable. They turned jungle trees into chewing gum factories that operated according to natural cycles and required human skill to harvest and process. Maya chicle was the foundation for the modern chewing gum industry, which eventually replaced natural tree sap with synthetic polymers that are easier to produce, more consistent in quality, and completely devoid of the connection to nature that made original chicle special. Modern gum is convenient, but it lacks the environmental awareness and artisanal quality that characterized Maya chicle production. The Maya understood that some pleasures are worth the effort required to obtain them. They climbed trees, processed sap, and developed social customs around chewing tree products, because they understood that small luxuries could make life significantly more enjoyable. Chicle chewing was proof that the Maya had sophisticated understanding of the relationship between effort, scarcity, and pleasure, and they did it all without artificial flavors, synthetic polymers, or the ability to mass-produce gum in factories. They created the original chewing gum using nothing but trees, human ingenuity, and the understanding that sometimes the best things in life require you to literally climb for them. Modern gum manufacturers owe their entire industry to Maya chicle collectors who figured out that tree sap was worth chewing, even if it meant risking life and limb to collect it from jungle canopies. The Maya invented chewing gum and made it a luxury item worthy of gods and nobles, which is more than most modern innovations can claim. In Maya society, what you ate wasn't just about nutrition or personal preference. It was a public declaration of your social status, political connections, and whether you were important enough to deserve food that actually tasted good. Maya junk food was the ancient equivalent of driving a luxury car or wearing designer clothes, except the luxury car was a cup of chocolate, and the designer clothes were honey-sweetened tamales that cost more than most people's houses. The Maya had turned food consumption into a complex political system where your access to treats directly correlated with your position in society. It was like having a country club membership, except the country club was civilization itself, and the membership fees were paid in tribute, military service, or whatever the nobles decided you owed them this week. Cacao was so politically significant that it was literally used as currency, which meant that drinking chocolate was essentially the same as eating money. Maya nobles could afford to consume their wealth in liquid form, while commoners had to decide whether they wanted to eat their money or spend it on basic necessities like corn and shelter. It was the ultimate display of, I'm so wealthy, I can literally drink my net worth and still have enough left over for a palace. The control of honey production was a source of political power that could determine the success or failure of entire city-states. Maya rulers who controlled productive beekeeping regions had significant advantages in trade negotiations, military campaigns, and diplomatic relationships. They were essentially running ancient cartels based on bee products, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that modern nations have fought wars over oil, coffee, and spice trade routes. Maya tribute systems were organized around luxury food items that demonstrated the political relationships between different cities and rulers. Conquered territories were required to provide cacao, honey, exotic meats, and other premium foods to their overlords, creating economic relationships that were enforced through military power and maintained through the constant threat of having your luxury food supplies cut off. The Maya developed food-based diplomacy that would make modern politicians jealous of their creativity and effectiveness. Maya rulers hosted elaborate feasts featuring the finest foods available, using their culinary resources to impress foreign dignitaries, negotiate political alliances, and demonstrate their wealth and power. These diplomatic dinners were the ancient equivalent of state dinners, except the stakes were higher and the food was probably better. Maya social hierarchy was literally written in the food people were allowed to eat. Nobles ate chocolate, honey, exotic meats, and elaborate tamales. Warriors earned the right to better food through their military service. Priests received premium foods as part of their religious compensation. Common people ate corn, beans, and whatever treats they could afford during special occasions. It was a system where your diet was your ID card, and everyone could tell your social status just by looking at your lunch. The restriction of certain foods to specific social classes created black markets and underground food economies that operated parallel to the official tribute systems. Maya commoners who wanted to taste chocolate or honey had to find creative ways to obtain luxury foods that were officially forbidden to them. It was like prohibition, except instead of alcohol, people were secretly trading in sweeteners and caffeinated beverages. Maya rulers used food restrictions as a form of social control that was both practical and symbolic. By limiting access to luxury foods, they reinforced social hierarchies and reminded people of their place in society. By controlling the distribution of treats, they could reward loyalty, punish disobedience, and maintain the kind of social order that kept them in power. It was government through gastronomy, powered by the understanding that people who control dessert access control society. The Maya also used food gifts as political tools that could create obligations, demonstrate favor, and establish relationships between different social groups. Giving someone access to luxury foods was a way of acknowledging their importance, while withdrawing food privileges was a way of expressing displeasure without resorting to violence. It was soft power politics, implemented through honey and chocolate distribution. Maya religious authorities controlled access to certain foods that were considered sacred and appropriate only for divine consumption or religious ceremonies. This gave priests significant political power, since they could determine who was worthy of consuming god-level food and who had to settle for mortal-level nutrition. It was theocracy implemented through menu restrictions, which was probably more effective than modern separation of church and state. The economics of Maya luxury food were designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of people who could afford to eat well, while everyone else survived on basic rations. This created economic incentives for political loyalty, military service, and religious devotion that were reinforced every time people sat down to eat. It was a system where every meal was a reminder of your place in society and your relationship to power. Maya food laws were probably as complex as modern tax codes, but more delicious and with higher stakes for violations. There were likely regulations about who could consume which foods, when luxury items could be eaten, and what penalties applied to people who violated food restrictions. Breaking food laws was probably considered both criminal and sacrilegious, making it doubly dangerous for people who wanted to eat above their station. Maya trade relationships were built around the exchange of luxury foods that created dependencies and alliances between different regions and rulers. Cities that produced cacao could demand political concessions from cities that needed chocolate. Regions with productive beehives could leverage their honey production into political influence. It was international relations powered by snack food diplomacy. The Maya understood that controlling food production and distribution was essential for maintaining political power and social stability. They created systems that used luxury foods as tools for governance, social control, and international diplomacy. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was political infrastructure that supported their entire civilization. Maya junk food politics were so effective that they lasted for over 1,000 years, creating stable societies that were organized around the principle that political power and access to good food were inseparable. Modern politicians who promise economic prosperity and social programs are essentially offering updated versions of Maya food-based politics, except with less chocolate and more bureaucracy. The Maya proved that luxury foods could be used to create political systems that were both sophisticated and delicious. They turned treats into tools of statecraft and made junk food into a foundation for civilization. It was government through gastronomy, and it worked remarkably well for people who understood that the way to a civilization's heart was through its stomach. And they did it all without modern agricultural systems, global trade networks, or the ability to import luxury foods from other continents. They created political systems based entirely on local resources and human creativity, proving that effective governance doesn't require complicated institutions, just an understanding of how to use food to create the kind of society where people want to participate. If you think modern music festivals get out of hand, you clearly haven't experienced a Maya celebration where the entire community spent days consuming hallucinogenic honey drinks, dancing until they collapsed, bleeding themselves for the gods, and eating their weight in foods that were normally reserved for people who didn't have to farm corn for a living. Maya festivals weren't casual weekend events where people showed up, ate some food trucks, and went home. They were community-wide spiritual marathons that combined religious devotion, social bonding, and the kind of epic food consumption that would make modern, competitive eaters question their life choices. These were celebrations where the line between sacred ceremony and sanctioned bacchanalia was creatively interpreted by people who understood that sometimes the gods wanted humans to party like the world was ending. The preparation for major Maya festivals began weeks in advance, and involved the entire community working together to produce massive quantities of food that were far beyond what anyone could afford or consume during normal circumstances. Maya festival food preparation was like planning Thanksgiving dinner for 1,000 people, except the 1,000 people were also expecting spiritual enlightenment and divine intervention along with their meal. Maya women organized themselves into cooking cooperatives that operated like ancient catering companies, except the clients were gods and the payment was cosmic favor rather than money. These cooking groups prepared hundreds of honey tamales, vast quantities of chocolate, fermented beverages that required careful timing, and specialty foods that were only made during specific celebrations. It was community organizing through culinary collaboration, powered by the shared understanding that festivals required food that was worthy of divine attention. The quantity of food consumed during Maya festivals was staggering by any standards. Archaeological evidence suggests that major celebrations involved the consumption of thousands of tamales, hundreds of gallons of alcoholic beverages, and enough chocolate to supply a modern coffee shop for months. Maya festival attendees weren't just eating. They were participating in communal binges that were both religiously required and socially encouraged. Maya festivals featured food stations that were set up throughout the celebration areas, creating ancient versions of food courts where people could sample different specialties as they moved between various ceremonial activities. There were chocolate serving areas where specialists prepared fresh drinks, honey tamale distribution points where families could collect their festival rations, and alcoholic beverage stations where people could obtain the drinks necessary for proper spiritual celebration. The social dynamics of Maya festival eating were complex enough to require protocols that governed who ate what, when they could eat it, and how much they were allowed to consume. Maya festivals weren't free-for-all eating events. They were carefully organized celebrations where food distribution was managed according to social status, religious obligations, and the practical necessity of making sure everyone got fed before the food ran out. Maya festival foods were specifically designed to be consumed in large quantities over extended periods of time. The honey tamales were sized for festival eating. The alcoholic beverages were formulated for sustained consumption, and the chocolate was prepared in versions that could be consumed throughout multi-day celebrations without causing immediate health problems. Maya cooks understood festival food engineering better than modern event planners who struggle to feed large crowds efficiently. The ritual significance of Maya festival eating transformed food consumption into religious observance that was both meaningful and enjoyable. Maya festival attendees weren't just eating for pleasure. They were participating in sacred ceremonies that connected them to their gods, their ancestors, and their community members. It was spiritual practice implemented through strategic overeating, which was probably more effective than modern meditation techniques and definitely more delicious. Maya festivals also featured competitive eating elements that would be familiar to modern competitive food consumption enthusiasts. Maya warriors and nobles competed to see who could consume the most chocolate, alcohol, or specialty foods during festival celebrations. These competitions were both entertainment and demonstrations of status, proving that people who could afford to eat competitively were obviously important enough to waste food on show. The aftermath of Maya festivals required community cleanup efforts that involved not just removing decorations and cleaning cooking areas, but also caring for people who had overindulged in foods and beverages that were much richer than their normal diet. Maya festival recovery was probably a community responsibility that required organized support for people who had participated too enthusiastically in the celebration. Maya children experienced festivals as educational opportunities, where they learned about proper food preparation, social hierarchies, and religious obligations through direct participation in community celebrations. Maya festivals were like immersive cultural education programs, where children learned their society's values through hands-on experience with food, ceremony, and community cooperation. The economic impact of Maya festivals was enormous, requiring communities to invest significant resources in food production, preparation, and distribution that went far beyond normal subsistence requirements. Maya festivals were essentially economic events that redistributed wealth through food consumption, creating temporary abundance that was shared throughout the community, regardless of normal social hierarchies. Maya festival foods were also used as diplomatic tools that demonstrated community wealth, organizational capability, and cultural sophistication to visitors from other cities and regions. Maya communities competed to host the most impressive festivals, using their culinary capabilities to enhance their political reputation and attract favorable trade relationships. The seasonal timing of Maya festivals was coordinated with agricultural cycles that determined when communities had surplus food available for celebration rather than storage or trade. Maya festival calendars were essentially economic planning documents that balanced religious obligations with practical resource management. Maya festivals created temporary food economies, where normal scarcity was replaced by deliberate abundance, allowing entire communities to experience the kind of luxury eating that was usually reserved for nobles and priests. These celebrations were social experiments in equality through excess, proving that Maya society understood the importance of periodic wealth redistribution through community feasting. The Maya created festival traditions that transformed food scarcity into community celebration, turned religious obligation into social bonding, and made luxury eating into shared cultural experiences that strengthened community relationships and provided temporary escape from the normal hardships of Maya life. Maya festivals were proof that humans need periodic opportunities to eat, drink, and celebrate beyond the requirements of basic survival. They created community celebrations that were both spiritually meaningful and nutritionally excessive, demonstrating that the best festivals combine religious devotion with really good food and the kind of social permission that allows people to temporarily abandon normal dietary restraint. And they did it all without modern event planning, industrial food production, or the ability to order festival supplies online. They created community celebrations that were worthy of their sophisticated civilization and memorable enough to sustain cultural traditions for over 1,000 years. Modern music festivals are still trying to match the combination of spiritual significance, community participation, and epic food consumption that Maya celebrations achieved using nothing but local ingredients, human organization, and the understanding that sometimes the best way to honor the gods is to throw a party that lasts for days. The Maya understood something that modern funeral directors are still figuring out. Death is a journey that requires proper snacks. Maya burial practices weren't just about respectfully disposing of bodies. They were about packing the deceased for the ultimate road trip through the underworld, with enough luxury foods to maintain their social status in the afterlife, and convince whatever supernatural beings they encountered that they were worth keeping around. Maya nobles weren't buried with just their jewelry and weapons. They were interred with complete dining sets that included elaborate chocolate vessels, honey containers, tamales wrapped in banana leaves, and enough preserved foods to sustain a small restaurant for weeks. It was ancient meal prep taken to its logical extreme, except the meals were for eternity, and the prep work was done by grieving family members who understood that afterlife cuisine was serious business. The Maya believed that death was essentially a relocation to a different neighborhood that happened to be populated by gods, demons, and deceased ancestors, who had developed sophisticated opinions about proper etiquette and acceptable food offerings. Maya funeral food preparation was like catering for the world's most demanding clients, except the clients were supernatural beings, and the catering had to last forever. Maya chocolate vessels found in tombs were works of art that were specifically designed for afterlife chocolate consumption. These containers were decorated with images of gods, underworld scenes, and instructions for proper chocolate preparation that would help the deceased navigate the complex social requirements of divine dining. Maya death chocolate was apparently more elaborate than life chocolate, which suggests that afterlife entertaining had higher standards than mortal social gatherings. The honey containers buried with Maya nobles were filled with the finest honey available, sealed with natural waxes, and positioned in tombs according to religious protocols that ensured the deceased would have access to premium sweeteners throughout eternity. Maya funeral tamales were prepared using the same techniques and ingredients that were used for festival tamales, except they were made specifically for underworld consumption and wrapped in banana leaves that had been blessed by priests who understood the dietary requirements of deceased nobles. Maya death tamales were essentially eternal comfort food that was designed to make the afterlife feel more like home. The Maya also buried their dead with preserved fruits, nuts, and other foods that would provide variety in the underworld diet, while demonstrating the deceased's sophisticated palate and their family's ability to afford luxury foods, even for dead relatives. Maya afterlife meal planning was more comprehensive than most modern retirement planning, and probably more effective at ensuring long-term satisfaction. Maya funeral food preparation was a family responsibility that required extensive knowledge of preservation techniques, religious protocols, and the deceased's personal food preferences. Maya families couldn't just order afterlife catering from a funeral home. They had to personally prepare foods that would represent their loved one's status and taste throughout eternity. It was the ultimate expression of family devotion, implemented through strategic food preservation. The quality of Maya funeral foods was used as evidence of the deceased's social importance and their family's respect for proper burial traditions. Maya tombs were essentially restaurant reviews that were written in preserved foods and luxury containers, demonstrating to future archaeologists exactly how much the deceased had been valued by their community. Maya priests who specialized in funeral food preparation understood both the technical requirements of food preservation and the spiritual significance of feeding the dead. These religious specialists were like ancient nutritionists who had expertise in both metabolism and metaphysics, ensuring that funeral foods would be both physically preserved and spiritually appropriate for underworld consumption. The Maya believed that improper funeral food preparation could result in hungry ghosts, angry ancestors, and supernatural problems that would affect the entire family for generations. Maya funeral catering wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was about preventing posthumous revenge from relatives who had been inadequately provisioned for their eternal journey. Maya afterlife food economics were significant enough to influence family financial planning and social obligations. Preparing proper funeral foods required substantial investment in premium ingredients, specialized containers, and religious services that could bankrupt families who were determined to send their relatives into the afterlife with appropriate dining options. The Maya also prepared special foods for deceased children, warriors, and priests that reflected their specific roles and social positions. Maya afterlife cuisine was customized according to the deceased's occupation, age, and spiritual status, creating personalized meal plans that were designed to meet individual nutritional and social requirements in the underworld. Maya funeral food traditions created economic opportunities for specialists who understood preservation techniques, container production, and religious protocols. Maya communities supported craftspeople who made funeral chocolate vessels, food preservation experts, and religious practitioners who ensured that afterlife catering met divine standards. The seasonal timing of Maya deaths influenced the types of foods that were available for funeral preparation, creating variations in afterlife cuisine that reflected agricultural cycles and resource availability. Maya families had to balance their desire to provide premium funeral foods with the practical limitations of what was available when their relatives died. Maya children learned about afterlife food preparation by observing funeral ceremonies and understanding that proper death required proper snacks. Maya funeral traditions were educational experiences that taught young people about food preservation, religious obligations, and the importance of planning ahead for major life transitions. The Maya created funeral traditions that transformed death from an ending into a well-provisioned journey, ensuring that their deceased relatives would have access to the same luxury foods in the afterlife that they had enjoyed during their mortal lives. Maya funeral foods were proof that good eating was considered essential for both temporal and eternal happiness. Maya afterlife cuisine was more elaborate than most modern restaurant dining, and probably more expensive than contemporary funeral services. The Maya understood that death was just another social occasion that required appropriate refreshments, proper presentation, and the kind of careful planning that ensured everyone involved would be satisfied with the outcome. The Maya proved that love for family members didn't end with death. It continued through elaborate food preparation, that demonstrated ongoing care and respect for deceased relatives. Maya funeral foods were the ultimate expression of, we're going to miss you, but we're also going to make sure you eat well wherever you're going. And they did it all without modern preservation technology, refrigeration, or the ability to order specialty funeral foods online. They created afterlife catering services that were worthy of their sophisticated civilization and comprehensive enough to ensure that death was just another opportunity for really good eating. Let's be honest, you probably think you could handle Maya junk food because you've conquered ghost peppers, survived gas station sushi, and maybe even eaten at that sketchy food truck that doesn't have a proper health department rating. But Maya treats would challenge your modern palate in ways that would make you question your entire relationship with food and possibly send you running back to your local Starbucks for something that actually tastes familiar. Maya chocolate wasn't the smooth, sweet, creamy beverage you're imagining. It was bitter, gritty, spicy, and occasionally mixed with human blood for special occasions. Drinking Maya chocolate was like consuming liquid tree bark that had been seasoned with chili peppers and disappointment. Modern people who complain about dark chocolate being too bitter would probably faint after one sip of authentic Maya cacao preparation. The texture alone would defeat most contemporary chocolate lovers. Maya chocolate was foamy, grainy, and had the consistency of liquid sand mixed with spices. There was no sugar to mask the natural bitterness of cacao, no milk to create creamy smoothness, and definitely no artificial flavors to make it taste like anything other than ground-up tree seeds mixed with fire. Maya chocolate was an acquired taste that most modern people would never acquire, no matter how long they tried. Maya honey was different from the clover honey you squeeze from plastic bears at the grocery store. Melipona bee honey had complex flavors that varied depending on what flowers the bees had visited, what season the honey was harvested, and how long it had been stored in conditions that didn't include modern preservation technology. Maya honey could be tangy, fermented, or flavored with jungle plants that don't exist in modern agriculture. It was artisanal honey that came with no quality guarantees and possibly some interesting microbial additions. The sweet tamales that Maya nobles considered appropriate offerings for gods would probably confuse modern dessert expectations. Maya sweet tamales were made with corn masa, honey, ground seeds, and spices that created flavor combinations, unlike anything in contemporary cuisine. They were sweet, but not sugar sweet. They were substantial, but not cake-like. They were wrapped in banana leaves that imparted earthy flavors that modern people associate with compost rather than dessert. Maya alcoholic beverages would challenge contemporary drinking preferences in ways that would make craft beer enthusiasts reconsider their adventurous palates. Balshay was fermented honey mixed with tree bark that contained psychoactive compounds, creating drinks that were simultaneously alcoholic and mildly hallucinogenic. Modern people who think absinthe is exotic would probably hallucinate after one cup of properly prepared balshay, assuming they could get past the taste of fermented tree bark. Maya meat preparations would horrify modern diners who are squeamish about anything more exotic than chicken nuggets. Roasted iguana, smoked monkey, and various jungle animals that were prepared with techniques designed to maximize flavor rather than minimize psychological impact. Maya luxury meats were fresh, wild, and prepared by people who understood that food came from actual animals, rather than sanitized packages in refrigerated display cases. The Maya popcorn that ancient people considered satisfying snacks was seasoned with chili peppers, salt, and spices that would challenge modern snack food expectations. Maya popcorn wasn't butter-flavored or cheese-dusted. It was spicy, natural, and probably too intense for people who think jalapeno chips are hot. Modern moviegoers who complain about overpriced theater popcorn would probably pay premium prices for Maya popcorn, assuming they could handle the authentic flavors. Maya chicle was tree sap that had the consistency of rubber and the flavor of forest. Modern chewing gum is artificially flavored, synthetically sweetened, and designed for easy chewing. Maya chicle was tough, bitter, and required serious jaw strength to chew effectively. People who struggle with sugar-free gum would probably give up on chicle after 5 minutes of aggressive chewing that produced minimal flavor reward. The portion sizes of Maya luxury foods would disappoint modern people who are accustomed to supersized everything. Maya honey tamales were small, dense, and designed for special occasions rather than casual consumption. Maya chocolate was served in cups that held maybe 4 ounces of liquid, not the 20-ounce beverages that modern people consider normal serving sizes. Maya junk food was precious, limited, and consumed in quantities that reflected its actual value, rather than manufactured abundance. The social rules surrounding Maya food consumption would frustrate modern people who expect immediate access to whatever they want to eat. Maya luxury foods were restricted by social status, religious protocols, and economic availability. Modern people who expect to buy chocolate whenever they want it would struggle with Maya systems where chocolate consumption required noble birth, religious approval, or enough wealth to purchase cacao beans that were literally used as currency. Maya food preparation techniques would exhaust modern people who are accustomed to convenience foods and instant gratification. Maya sweet tamales required days of preparation, community cooperation, and technical skills that took years to master. Modern people who consider cooking to be reheating takeout would probably abandon Maya junk food preparation after realizing that making proper honey tamales was more complicated than their day jobs. The Maya also consumed their luxury foods in social contexts that required patience, ceremony, and respect for complex cultural protocols. Modern people who eat while scrolling through their phones would struggle with Maya eating traditions that required full attention, proper prayers, and careful adherence to social hierarchies that determined who could eat what and when. Maya junk food was challenging, complex, and designed for people who understood that good food required effort, patience, and acceptance of flavors that were determined by nature rather than food scientists. Modern palates that have been trained on processed foods, artificial flavors, and convenient consumption would probably find authentic Maya treats to be too intense, too unfamiliar, and too demanding for casual enjoyment. The closest modern equivalent to Maya sweet tamales might be artisanal desserts from expensive restaurants that specialize in unusual flavor combinations and natural ingredients. But even high-end modern cuisine is designed for contemporary tastes that expect familiar sweetness and recognizable textures. You probably couldn't handle Maya junk food, but that's not necessarily a criticism of your culinary adventurousness. Maya treats were designed for people who lived in a completely different food environment and had developed tastes that reflected their specific cultural and environmental circumstances. They were sophisticated, complex, and worthy of the advanced civilization that created them, even if they would challenge modern expectations about what junk food should taste like. So there you have it. The Maya managed to create an entire junk food culture without a single drive-through window, vending machine, or late-night convenience store run. They turned tree sap into chewing gum, corn kernels into addictive snacks, and honey into liquid gold that was literally worth more than actual gold. They accomplished all of this while living in jungle conditions that would send modern food safety inspectors into panic attacks. The Maya didn't have processed sugar, but they created sweetness that was worth fighting wars over. They didn't have artificial flavors, but they developed taste combinations that were complex enough to please gods and sophisticated enough to serve as diplomatic gifts between competing city-states. They didn't have mass production, but they created treats that were so special, so rare, and so delicious that people built entire economic systems around controlling access to them. Think about that for a moment. The Maya created chocolate that was considered sacred enough to serve as currency, honey that was valuable enough to base political alliances on, and tamales that were perfect enough to offer to supernatural beings. Modern junk food manufacturers spend billions of dollars on research and development, marketing campaigns, and artificial flavor enhancement. But they've never created anything that was considered appropriate food for gods. Maya junk food required skill, patience, and community cooperation that made every treat a genuine achievement. Modern people can buy chocolate bars at gas stations, but Maya people had to climb trees to collect cacao beans, grind them by hand, and perform religious ceremonies to create chocolate that was worthy of consumption. They understood that the best things in life require effort, and they were willing to invest that effort in creating food experiences that were both delicious and meaningful. The Maya also understood something that modern society is still figuring out. Luxury foods are only special when they're actually luxurious. Maya honey was precious because it was rare, difficult to obtain, and required specialized knowledge to harvest safely. Maya chocolate was sacred because it was expensive, ceremonially prepared, and restricted to people who had earned the right to consume it. Maya junk food was junk food because it was the opposite of everyday survival food, not because it was mass-produced convenience food. Modern junk food is designed to be cheap, convenient, and instantly satisfying. But it's also forgettable, artificial, and available to anyone with pocket change. Maya junk food was expensive, inconvenient, and required serious commitment to obtain. But it was also memorable, authentic, and created social connections that lasted for generations. The Maya proved that human beings have always needed treats, celebrations, and foods that serve pleasure rather than mere survival. They created elaborate systems for producing, distributing, and consuming luxury foods, because they understood that civilization isn't just about staying alive. It's about creating experiences that make life worth living. They turned simple ingredients into complex pleasures, using nothing but creativity, tradition, and the understanding that food is about more than nutrition. Maya cooks didn't have access to artificial ingredients, but they had access to imagination. They didn't have modern technology, but they had techniques that had been refined over centuries of trial and error. They didn't have global supply chains, but they had local resources that they understood better than most modern people understand their own kitchen appliances. Maya junk food was also proof that sustainable luxury is possible when people understand their environment and work within natural systems rather than against them. Maya beekeeping was environmentally conscious. Maya cacao cultivation was sustainable. And Maya hunting practices maintained ecological balance. They created luxury foods that enhanced their civilization without destroying the natural systems that supported it. The Maya managed to build a sophisticated junk food culture while maintaining stable populations, creating impressive architecture, developing advanced mathematics, and conducting accurate astronomical observations. They didn't choose between intellectual achievement and culinary pleasure. They combined both into a civilization that was both brilliant and delicious. Modern society could learn something from Maya approaches to luxury food consumption. They understood that the best treats are worth waiting for, that good food requires good ingredients, and that eating should be a social activity that brings people together rather than isolating them with individual convenience foods. So the next time you unwrap a candy bar, remember, it all started in a temple with a bitter, frothy, chili-laced cup of cacao that was prepared by people who understood that chocolate was serious business. The next time you chew gum, remember that you're participating in a tradition that began with Maya, people climbing dangerous trees to collect sap because they believed that some pleasures were worth risking their lives for. The Maya had no ice cream, no cotton candy, no processed snacks that could survive nuclear attacks, but they lived deliciously anyway, creating treats that were worthy of their gods, appropriate for their nobles, and memorable enough to inspire stories that are still being told over 1,000 years later. They proved that junk food doesn't have to be junk. It can be art, culture, and civilization, all wrapped up in banana leaves and served with proper ceremony. They created pleasure foods that were both indulgent and meaningful, both delicious and significant. Modern junk food is convenient, but Maya junk food was transformative. Modern treats are satisfying, but Maya treats were sacred. Modern snacks are available, but Maya snacks were worth fighting for. The Maya invented junk food, and they did it right the first time. Everything since then has just been variations on themes that were perfected in jungle temples by people who understood that the best things in life are worth the effort required to obtain them. They had no ice cream, but they had imagination. They had no processed sugar, but they had sweetness. They had no artificial flavors, but they had flavor combinations that modern food scientists are still trying to recreate. They lived deliciously, and they did it all without compromising their principles, destroying their environment, or forgetting that food is one of humanity's greatest arts. Not bad for people who had to make everything from scratch.